The fog that descended upon the Harper residence that October night was no mere meteorological phenomenon. It was a shroud, a thick, greasy vapor that clung to the old house, silencing the world outside and seemingly suffocating the very light from the street lamps. It was as if the house itself was exhaling a sickness, a prelude to the horror that had taken root within. Father Michael felt at the moment his car turned onto their long, unlit driveway. This was more than a troubled spirit, this was an ancient wrongness. His call had come from a woman named Eleanor Harper, her voice a frayed thread of terror and exhaustion. She spoke of her daughter, Lily, in broken whispers, describing a complete and terrifying transformation. It wasn't just strange behavior, it was an erasure of the child she knew. Disembodied voices echoed from Lily's room, objects would be hurled across the floor by an unseen hand, and the family's beloved dog refused to even go near the upstairs hallway. These were familiar signs, but the sheer desperation in Mrs. Harper's voice signaled an infestation far more virulent than usual. The house itself seemed to confirm his fears. It was a grand but decaying Victorian, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its windows like vacant eyes staring into the fog. It sagged under the weight of a history that felt palpably malevolent. Inside, the Harper family looked like ghosts in their own home. Eleanor had dark, hollowed-out eyes and faint, crescent-shaped scratches on her arms she couldn't remember getting. Her husband, Tom, had lost a dramatic amount of weight, his frame thin and brittle. Their son, Alex, a quiet boy of 10, had stopped speaking 2 weeks prior. He just sat in the corner of the living room, drawing in a sketchbook with a frantic, obsessive energy. They recounted the progression of Lily's affliction. It began with her knowing things, shameful secrets of her parents' youth, the hidden anxieties of her brother, details that were impossible for her to have learned. Then came the change in her voice, a low, guttural rasp that mocked them, speaking in languages she had never studied. Father Michael insisted on seeing her alone. As he ascended the stairs, he noticed the temperature drop with each step, a tomb-like cold that made his joints ache. The air grew thick with the cloying, unmistakable scent of the profane, a mixture of overturned grave soil and spoiled meat. He opened Lily's door and was met with a scene of quiet desecration. The room was unnaturally still. Lily sat on her bed, her back to him, her small frame rigid. Her movements were jerky and puppet-like as she turned to face him. Her face was pale, almost translucent, but it was her eyes that stole his breath. They were not the eyes of a child. They were black, oily pits of infinite depth, swallowing the dim light of the room. A voice, layered and ancient, slithered from her lips. "So, the little soldier of God arrives, reeking of incense and false hope." It laughed, a sound that was not one voice but many, a chorus of suffering and malice. "Tell me, Father," it hissed, leaning forward with an impossible crack of its neck, "do you still dream of the fire? The one that took your brother? I can show it to you again. I can make you feel the heat." It knew. This entity had not just invaded a home, it had dissected the souls within it. The priest felt a cold dread snake up his spine, but he steeled himself. This was not a negotiation. This was war. "I am here in the name of the Lord," he declared, his voice a shield against the suffocating evil. "And you will release this child." The entity laughed again, a sound that seemed to shake the very dust from the ceiling. "This child is ours," it snarled. "This house is ours. You are merely a guest, and you have overstayed your welcome." The drive back to the church was a blur. Father Michael knew the standard rites would be a child's shield against a tidal wave. This was a nesting entity, a demon of place and family, one that had likely seeped into the very foundation of the land the house was built on. He spent the night in the church's archives, poring over crumbling texts bound in human skin, searching for any mention of a demon that behaved this way. The text spoke of a collector of sorrows, an entity that fed on the grief and fear of a family until it was strong enough to consume one of them, using the hollowed-out shell as a gateway. Even in the sanctity of the church, he was not safe. As he read, a stack of hymnals at the far end of the library crashed to the floor. A cold whisper, carrying his mother's name, snaked through the silence. The entity's influence was reaching for him now, testing his defenses, trying to infect his sanctuary. He knew he had to return, and he had to end it. The next day, he brought more than just holy water and a crucifix. He brought relics, a sliver of bone from a forgotten saint, vials of blessed oil, and a heavy, iron-bound book of exorcism that the church rarely sanctioned for use. The Harpers had been instructed to wait outside. The risk of collateral damage, psychic or physical, was too great. He entered the house, which now felt like a mausoleum. He began the ritual in Lily's room, laying a thick circle of blessed salt, anointing the windows and doors. The air was glacial. Frost was beginning to form on the inside of the windowpanes. As he began the Latin incantations, the true battle commenced. It started with sound. From outside the room, the Harpers heard the voice of Eleanor's deceased mother calling for her, begging to be let in. They heard the sound of their dog, who had died a year prior, whining and scratching at the door. Inside, Father Michael was assaulted by visions, the fire that killed his brother, the faces of every person he felt he had failed. Then came the physical assault. The temperature dropped so low that the holy water in his vial began to freeze. Every object in the room not nailed down was hurled at him with violent force: books, lamps, pieces of the bed frame. Lily's body began to contort. Her limbs bent at angles that would have shattered human bones, her back arching until her head touched her heels. The bed she was on levitated 4 feet off the ground, rotating slowly in the center of the room. He pressed on, his voice raw, his faith the only shield against the maelstrom. "I command you, unclean spirit. By the power vested in me by Jesus Christ, I command you to depart." The entity roared its defiance. The walls themselves seemed to groan, and a thick, black, viscous ooze began to weep from the plaster, smelling of sulfur and decay. In the corner of the room, a shadow began to coalesce, a tall, spindly form that was blacker than the surrounding darkness, its presence a vortex of pure hatred. It was manifesting. Father Michael was tiring, his spiritual energy draining away. He felt his resolve beginning to crack. In a moment of desperation, he pulled out the small, worn rosary from his pocket, his grandmother's, and lunged forward, pressing the crucifix at its center against Lily's ice-cold forehead. The reaction was immediate and apocalyptic. A scream erupted from Lily, but it was not one voice. It was the sound of 1,000 souls in torment, a sonic blast of pure agony and rage that shattered the windows and cracked the ceiling. The levitating bed crashed to the floor. The shadowy form in the corner dissipated with a final, hateful hiss. The black ooze on the walls sizzled and evaporated. And then, silence. A heavy, scarred silence. Lily lay on the broken bed, limp and catatonic, her body covered in a cold sweat. Father Michael collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his body aching as if he had been physically beaten. The battle was won. He stumbled out of the room to the waiting, terrified family. He could only nod, too exhausted to speak. But as they helped him down the stairs, he felt a final, chilling whisper brush against his mind. It wasn't a roar, but a calm, venomous promise left behind like a poison. "This house is our garden. You have only pulled a single weed. The roots run deep, and the harvest is not yet over." They led him to the living room, where the son, Alex, sat in his usual corner, still drawing. He hadn't made a sound during the entire ordeal. As his mother knelt to comfort him, Alex slowly looked up, his eyes wide and blank. He held up his sketchbook. On the page was a detailed, terrifying drawing of the shadowy, spindly figure he could not have possibly seen. It was standing in Lily's room. But in the drawing, it wasn't alone. It was holding the hand of a small boy. Alex stared at his mother, his expression empty. And in a faint, dry whisper that perfectly mimicked the entity's mocking tone, he said, "It says it's my turn now."